The icy winds screamed across the barren landscape. The ground was a frozen wasteland, covered in layers of white frost and jagged rock formations that looked like the remains of ancient towers long forgotten. Beneath the harsh, unforgiving sky, an alien woman lay motionless, her breath shallow and slow. She was a warrior, strong, fierce, and once part of a race that considered themselves superior to all others. But now she was nothing more than a dying figure on a cold, desolate planet. Her name was Alice, and she had been left to die. Her mission had failed. Her ship, the pride of her fleet, had been destroyed in a fierce battle with the human forces. She had been on a reconnaissance mission to Earth, gathering intel for her race's planned invasion. But humans, as weak and primitive as they seemed, had proven to be far more resourceful than she'd anticipated. The humans had turned the tide of the war, forcing her fleet into retreat. She had barely managed to escape with her life, only to crash on this desolate world. Her species, once so proud and confident in their superiority, had abandoned her. The cold, numb feeling in her chest wasn't just from the freezing temperatures. It was the bitter sting of betrayal. Her comrades, those she had fought beside for years, had made the decision to leave her behind. She was injured, alone, and unimportant to them now. The pain in her side was unbearable. She tried to move, but her body refused to obey. Every breath she took seemed like a struggle against the freezing air that cut through her skin like 1,000 knives. Her glowing blue markings, a symbol of her race's strength, now seemed dim, almost as if they, too, had given up on her. As she lay there, her thoughts became foggy, and her vision blurred. She thought back to her life before all of this, the battles, the glory, the pride of her people. She had never imagined ending up like this. She had always believed that her race was destined to rule over all others. The humans would never stand a chance against their might. Now she felt small, alone, defenseless. With each passing minute, her chances of survival grew slimmer. The cold was relentless, seeping into her very bones. She was certain that death was near. There would be no grand battle or heroic last stand. No rescue, no final words. Just the quiet end, alone on a forgotten world. But then, through the fog of pain and fading consciousness, she heard something. A faint sound, a low hum, like the vibration of an engine. Was it just her imagination? Or was someone still out there, coming for her? She couldn't be sure, but the sound was getting louder. She forced her eyes open, struggling to focus on the horizon. There, through the swirling snow, a figure appeared. At first, it seemed like a mirage, a trick of the light in the harsh conditions. But as it drew closer, the shape became more distinct. A ship, small and sleek, cutting through the storm, its engines glowing faintly against the dark sky. It wasn't one of her kind. It wasn't even an alien ship. It was a human craft. A human. Alice's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Her race had always viewed humans as weak, inferior beings. How could a human be out here, on this forgotten planet? The very thought was almost laughable. But as the ship descended, her heart skipped a beat. There was no time for disbelief or confusion. She was too weak to move, too far gone to put up a fight. The only thing she could do now was watch, helpless. The ship landed with a soft thud, the engines powering down as the door slid open. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the dim light of the ship's engine. Alice couldn't see him clearly at first, but she could tell he was human. He wasn't wearing the bulky armor of her race's warriors, nor the advanced combat suits of her enemies. He wore a simple uniform, a rugged-looking suit meant for exploration, with a patch that read Rescue Team. The human didn't hesitate. He walked towards her, unafraid of the alien in front of him. His eyes locked on her, and in those brief moments, something unexpected happened. Alice felt a strange sense of recognition. It wasn't just the human's bravery or his compassion. It was something deeper, something that transcended the hatred and pride she had carried for so long. The human kneeled beside her, his face filled with concern as he checked her pulse. She could barely focus on him, her mind still clouded by the pain and the cold. But she heard him speaking to her, words she didn't understand, his voice calm and steady. It didn't matter that she didn't understand his language. The tone of his voice was enough. He wasn't here to fight her. He wasn't here to finish what his kind had started. He was here to save her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alice felt a flicker of hope. She had been abandoned, left to die in a cold desert. But now, a human, a species she had once scorned, had found her, and he was offering her something she hadn't thought possible, a chance to survive. Her thoughts began to clear, and her heartbeat, though faint, steadied. She could feel the human's hands on her, gently lifting her into his arms, carrying her back to his ship. For a moment, the cold didn't feel so overwhelming. The pain didn't seem so unbearable, and as she closed her eyes, drifting into unconsciousness, she couldn't help but wonder. Could it be that humanity, the very species she had once considered weak, might be her salvation? The ship's engines hummed softly as it touched down on the frozen surface of the alien planet. Bonner adjusted his helmet and checked his equipment one last time before stepping out of the airlock. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his thick spacesuit like it was paper. He barely felt it, though. His mind was focused solely on the mission. His team had been tracking a strange signal from deep space, an odd distress call that seemed to be coming from an alien vessel. The coordinates led them here, to this barren planet where nothing had ever been recorded. The only thing that mattered was finding the source of the signal and figuring out what was going on. Bonner wasn't supposed to be out here alone. He had been part of a team, a specialized unit that had been trained for these kinds of operations. But something had gone wrong. His team had split up during the search. The others had found nothing but wreckage and some abandoned technology. Bonner, however, had a feeling that the signal was more than just a false alarm. He trusted his instincts, and they had never failed him before. He trekked through the snow, his boots crunching loudly against the frozen ground. The signal was getting stronger, guiding him toward its source. As he walked, he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was watching him. The planet was silent, too silent. The wind howled around him, but it didn't sound natural. It felt wrong, as if something had been waiting for him. He shook off the thought and kept moving. After hours of searching, he finally saw something in the distance, a figure lying motionless in the snow. His heart skipped a beat. It was a person, a humanoid figure, covered in strange markings that glowed faintly even in the darkness. He rushed over, hoping against hope that it wasn't too late. When he knelt beside her, he could see that the woman was in bad shape. Her skin was an unnatural shade of gray, and her eyes were closed, her breath ragged and shallow. He didn't know who she was or what race she belonged to, but she was clearly not human. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, some of them deep, and she was barely conscious. Bonner's mind raced. He knew this wasn't just some stranded explorer. This woman was a warrior, a soldier, and she had been left to die. He had seen her kind before, alien races that were far more advanced than humans. They were technologically superior, their ships sleek and powerful. They were part of the alien forces that had been attacking Earth, part of the reason Bonner and his team had been sent into space. He had never encountered one this close before, let alone in such a vulnerable state. For a moment, he hesitated. His mission was to investigate the distress signal, not to rescue someone from the enemy. This woman could be dangerous. She could be part of the alien force that had been trying to invade Earth. But then Bonner remembered the one thing that made humans different from the aliens: compassion. It wasn't just about winning wars or proving strength. It was about helping those who couldn't help themselves. Bonner set aside his doubts and focused on the task at hand. He checked her pulse and found it weak but steady. There was a chance she could survive, but only if he acted fast. He pulled her carefully into his arms, making sure not to cause her any more pain than necessary. Her body was cold, almost too cold, but she wasn't completely frozen yet. That was something. He made his way back to his ship, taking every precaution to make sure they weren't being followed. As he approached the ship, he could feel the weight of the situation settling in. There was no telling who, or what, might be out there, waiting to strike. He had to move quickly. The woman in his arms wasn't just an alien warrior. She was a symbol of everything humans were up against. And yet, she was the one he was saving. Once inside the ship, Bonner carefully laid her on a medical table in the back. He quickly set to work, using the ship's advanced medical equipment to stabilize her condition. He knew that his supplies were limited, and he couldn't afford to waste time. The first step was to get her body temperature back to normal. He activated the heating system in the medbay and wrapped her in thermal blankets, hoping that it would help. He worked tirelessly for hours, applying pressure to the worst of her wounds and using the ship's medical tools to treat her injuries. He didn't know what had happened to her or how she had ended up here, but he could tell that she was no ordinary soldier. There was something about her, something that made him feel that she was more than just a casualty of war. As the hours passed, the woman slowly began to stir. Bonner watched her closely, unsure if she would wake up. He couldn't help but wonder what she would think when she saw him, a human, taking care of her. Would she see him as a savior, or would she see him as an enemy? Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him with confusion. She tried to speak, but the words came out garbled, a language he didn't understand. Bonner felt a rush of relief at the fact that she was awake, but he also felt a strange tension in the air. He wasn't sure how she would react to him, or if she even understood that he was trying to help her. Bonner smiled gently, trying to reassure her, even though he had no idea what she was saying. "You're safe now," he said quietly, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he saw a flash of recognition, or maybe distrust, pass through them. She didn't know whether to trust him, and Bonner couldn't blame her. After everything she had been through, he was just another unknown, but he was determined to make her understand that he wasn't her enemy. As she drifted back into unconsciousness, Bonner couldn't help but wonder what had led her to this planet, why she had been abandoned. And most importantly, what would happen next? Would she see him as her savior, or as another threat to her survival? As the ship sailed silently through the cold void of space, Bonner's thoughts turned to the bigger picture. The galaxy was filled with countless alien races, each with their own agendas and motivations. But Bonner knew one thing for sure: humanity wasn't going to give up. And no matter who this woman was, no matter where she came from, he wasn't going to let her die alone. Bonner spent the next few hours checking and rechecking the status of the alien woman, who remained unconscious on the medical table. He had stabilized her injuries as best as he could, but there was only so much he could do alone. The ship's medical systems weren't designed for this. They weren't equipped to deal with a species he knew nothing about. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, but the most pressing one was whether or not he had done enough to save her. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. His mission had never included this kind of responsibility. He had been trained for combat, for finding and eliminating threats, not for rescuing someone, especially not an alien. Yet here he was, sitting in the cramped medbay of his ship, unsure of what would happen when she woke up. Was she a threat? Was she going to attack him as soon as she regained her strength? Or would she show gratitude, maybe even an understanding that he had saved her life? Bonner paced back and forth in the small room, his boots clicking softly against the floor. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He knew that they weren't alone. It wasn't just the cold and isolation of the planet that felt oppressive. It was a sense of being hunted. He could feel it in his bones. The humans had made enemies of many powerful alien races, and the thought of his ship being targeted was a constant concern. He couldn't afford to wait around too long. The longer he stayed on this planet, the more vulnerable they became. The woman stirred again, her breathing becoming a little more regular. Bonner stopped pacing and moved closer to her side, his heart quickening. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, just like before, and she scanned the room with a look of confusion. She tried to sit up, but Bonner placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, urging her to lie still. "You're safe. Don't move too much," he said softly, keeping his voice calm. The woman's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. Her face was still pale, but there was something stronger about her now, something more alive. Bonner noticed her body's subtle shift from weakness to strength, as though she was trying to find the energy to defend herself. But what surprised him most was the look of uncertainty in her eyes. She was looking at him as though she were trying to understand what had happened, as though she was trying to figure out who he was and whether he could be trusted. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out at first. Then she tried again, this time with more effort. You saved me." The words were broken and labored, but they were enough for Bonner to understand. He nodded, his voice steady. "I did. You were left behind, badly hurt. I couldn't just leave you there." The woman blinked in confusion, her eyes searching Bonner's face for something, perhaps for a sign that he wasn't lying, that he wasn't going to betray her. Bonner's mind raced. How could he explain himself to her when they came from two completely different worlds? Could she even understand him? He didn't know, but he had to try. "My people, we're not your enemy. Not anymore." Her gaze softened ever so slightly, but the mistrust in her eyes remained. She didn't speak again, but Bonner could feel the tension in her body. It wasn't easy for her to accept that someone who belonged to the very species she had been sent to conquer was now the one who had saved her life. She had been taught her entire life that humans were weak, inferior. To her, Bonner was likely the last being she'd expect to show any form of compassion, especially after her people had tried to wipe out humanity. But Bonner couldn't change the past. All he could do now was prove that he wasn't like the others. Minutes stretched into hours, and as the alien woman slowly regained strength, Bonner couldn't help but watch her closely. She was different from any enemy he'd ever encountered. There was a quiet strength in her, a fierceness that spoke of past battles and victories, and yet here she was, vulnerable and confused. She wasn't the cold, calculating soldier he'd imagined. She wasn't just a threat. She was a person. She shifted again, sitting up with Bonner's help, her expression still wary. It was clear she was gathering the strength to speak again, and when she finally did, her voice was rough, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. "Why? Why didn't you leave me?" Bonner didn't hesitate. "Because it's not who we are. I couldn't leave you to die, even if we were enemies." Her gaze seemed to soften for a moment, but she still seemed torn. The weight of her race's arrogance hung over her, and it was clear that she struggled with her own beliefs. For so long, she had been taught to look down on humans, to see them as insignificant, inferior creatures. The reality of her situation, being saved by a human, was nothing short of a paradox to her. The fact that she had been abandoned by her own people and then saved by the very species they had tried to conquer was a harsh truth she was struggling to accept. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would you help me?" Bonner sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because we're all just trying to survive. No one should be left behind, no matter who they are." The alien woman's gaze flickered down to the ground, and for a long time, she didn't speak. Bonner gave her the space she needed, hoping that she would come to understand his words. He wasn't expecting an immediate change of heart, but perhaps, just perhaps, in this small moment of vulnerability, he had given her a glimpse of what humans were really about. Compassion, mercy, and the belief that everyone deserved a chance, even if the odds were stacked against them. When she finally looked up again, her expression had softened, though the wariness still lingered in her eyes. "I don't know what will happen now," she said, her voice stronger. "But thank you." Bonner smiled, relieved that she had spoken those words. He didn't know where this strange bond between them would lead, but he was willing to fight for it. He wasn't just trying to survive the war. He was trying to change it, to show that humanity's strength wasn't just in their ability to fight, but in their capacity to save. As the ship sailed quietly through the stars, Bonner knew one thing for certain. This alien woman wasn't just another casualty of war. She was a symbol of hope, the beginning of something new. And he would do whatever it took to protect her, to prove that there was more to humanity than anyone had ever known. The days that followed were a blur of strange moments and uneasy silences. The alien woman, who still hadn't given Bonner her name, grew stronger with each passing day. Her wounds healed, and her body temperature returned to normal. The cold, barren planet outside the ship was a world she would never return to. She had been left behind by her own kind, abandoned to die in the freezing wastes of the desert. Yet now she was safe, safe because Bonner had found her. And now, more than ever, the weight of what that meant rested heavily on both of them. Bonner had never expected things to unfold the way they had. He had rescued her with no other thought than survival. But as he spent more time with her, he began to realize that this was no ordinary mission. This wasn't just about the alien threat or his mission to investigate the strange distress signal. It was about something deeper, a connection. The woman he had saved was more than a soldier. She was a person. She had hopes, fears, and like him, she was just trying to survive. But survival was something that came with a cost. Bonner knew that eventually they would have to part ways. Humanity and the alien race she represented were still enemies. The war between their species was far from over, and no matter how much he wanted to believe that things could change, the truth was impossible to ignore. The woman wasn't his ally. She wasn't someone he could trust fully. Not yet. But that didn't mean he couldn't try to understand her. As the days went on, the atmosphere in the ship shifted. The alien woman had started to trust him more, though still with caution. She would sometimes speak, telling Bonner about her world and her people, pieces of her life before the war began. But every conversation came with an undercurrent of sadness, as if she too had begun to realize that the bond between them could never truly be what it might have been in a different world. In another time. One night, as the stars streaked past the ship's windows, Bonner sat at the table, his mind weighed down with 1,000 questions. He had come to care about her, and it confused him. He had always been trained to view the enemy as just that, the enemy. But this woman wasn't a faceless soldier. She wasn't just a threat to humanity. She was a person with a past that had been shattered by the war, a war that both sides had suffered from. He glanced over at her. She was sitting near the viewport, her eyes fixed on the endless expanse of space, her expression distant. Bonner could see the exhaustion in her eyes, a deep, unspoken grief. He didn't know what she had lost, but it was clear that her world had been destroyed, just as much as his had been. He wondered if she could feel the same way, if she had ever begun to understand the painful truth of war. "I know what you must be thinking," Bonner said quietly, breaking the silence. "I know this isn't easy, but we're not the enemy to each other anymore. I saved you because it's the right thing to do." She turned to face him, her face unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. "You saved me because you had no choice," she replied, her voice low. "You couldn't let me die." Bonner frowned. "Maybe," he said, "but I also couldn't let you die because you're not just a soldier. You're someone who's been abandoned, just like us. We both lost everything." The woman's eyes softened, just slightly, but the walls around her heart didn't budge. She had been trained for battle, to see everything through the eyes of a soldier. Emotions, compassion. These were weaknesses. The very things that Bonner was showing her were things she had been taught to suppress. There was no room for them in her world. But now she was seeing something different. She didn't know how to process it. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You have your people. You have Earth. You have hope. But we lost everything. The war, we can't win. There's nothing left for me." Bonner's heart twisted at her words. He could hear the pain in her voice, The way she spoke of her people's inevitable defeat, it wasn't just bitterness, it was resignation. She had accepted that the world she knew was gone, that there was no place for her anymore. The war had consumed everything she had ever known. Her existence to her seemed like nothing more than a final echo of what had once been. Bonner stood and walked over to her, his footsteps slow and deliberate. When he reached her side, he looked out at the stars with her. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe Earth has a chance. Maybe we have hope. But that doesn't mean we can't change things. It doesn't mean we can't find a way to stop the war. We're not done yet. None of us are." The woman was silent for a long time, her gaze still fixed on the vastness of space. Bonner could sense the struggle within her. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of everything she had endured was too much to overcome. Her loyalty to her people, her training, her upbringing, all of it was pulling her in a different direction. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Bonner's heart sank. He understood. Trust had always been a fragile thing, easily broken by time and betrayal. He had been a soldier, just like her, and he knew that once trust was gone, it was nearly impossible to get it back. "You don't have to trust me," he replied, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to give up on you. And I'm not going to give up on what we can be, even if it's just a small chance." The woman didn't respond. She simply looked out at the stars, her thoughts a million miles away. Bonner knew that, deep down, she was beginning to question everything she had ever known. She wasn't ready to fully embrace the idea of peace, but maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to realize that not all enemies had to remain enemies forever. As the ship drifted silently through space, Bonner felt the weight of his words. He knew that a bond had formed between them, fragile as it was. It wasn't the kind of bond that could heal years of hatred and war, but it was a bond, nonetheless, and it was the only hope they had left. The calm of the ship was shattered by the shrill alarm blaring through the corridors. Bonner's heart raced as he scrambled from his quarters, his mind instantly racing to the worst-case scenario. His first thought was that the enemy had tracked them down. Somehow, despite the ship's cloaking device, he was on high alert as he bolted toward the command center, his boots echoing in the narrow hallway. The alien woman, now fully healed but still cautious and distant, was already there, standing by the control panels, her eyes scanning the readouts. "They found us," she said, her voice tight, betraying none of the calm she had managed to maintain in the past days. There was no longer any pretense of peace between them now. This was war, and they were back on the front lines. Bonner nodded grimly. "We need to move fast. We won't outrun them for long. What's the status of our engines?" "They've been damaged," she replied, not looking at him. "It's going to take time to get them back online, and the enemy is already in range." The urgency in her voice made Bonner's stomach drop. The enemy fleet was closing in, and they had no real defenses. The odds were slim that they would survive. Bonner took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could feel his pulse in his temples, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was no room for fear now. He had to protect her. He had to protect what little they had left. As he glanced at the alien woman, he saw something in her eyes, a spark. Maybe it was the same spark he had seen in her when they first met. Maybe it was the recognition that they were in this together, no matter what their pasts had been. Her people had once seen him as nothing more than a target. But now, in this moment, she wasn't just a soldier of the enemy. She was his ally. "We don't have much time," Bonner said, his voice low but determined. "We'll make our stand here. We've got a chance, and we're going to take it." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she nodded, her jaw set in determination. "What's the plan?" Bonner knew they didn't have the luxury of detailed strategies. They had no shields, no weapons, and no way to escape. But he had one thing the enemy didn't: the element of surprise, and a good chance to use the ship's cloaking device to give them the edge. "Here's what we're going to do," Bonner said. We'll cloak the ship, get close to their flagship, and sabotage their engines. If we can disable their fleet, we can create enough chaos for a counterattack. It's the only shot we've got." The alien woman hesitated for a split second. "It's a suicide mission." Bonner met her gaze, not flinching. "We don't have a choice. It's this or die trying." Without another word, they moved into action. Bonner accessed the ship's control panel and began to manipulate the cloaking systems, ensuring they would be undetectable to enemy sensors. The alien woman worked beside him, her knowledge of military tactics proving invaluable as she calculated the precise trajectory needed to reach the enemy flagship undetected. Her fingers flew across the controls, and for the first time since their uneasy alliance began, Bonner felt like they were truly working as a team. Once the ship was cloaked, they set off toward the enemy fleet. The vastness of space stretched out before them, a quiet contrast to the storm of chaos they knew awaited. Bonner's heart pounded in his chest as they drew closer to the enemy flagship. The tension in the air was thick, the silence almost unbearable. All they could hear was the soft hum of the ship's engines, a sound that felt like a countdown to their inevitable confrontation. As they neared the enemy flagship, Bonner's breath quickened. His mind was focused on the task at hand, but he couldn't help but glance at the alien woman who stood beside him, her eyes sharp and calculating. She didn't look afraid, but there was a glint of something in her eyes, something that reminded him of his own sense of purpose. They were in this together, and whatever happened next, they had a plan. "Ready?" Bonner asked, his voice barely a whisper. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Let's do this." With a final push of the button, the ship uncloaked. The enemy flagship, looming in the distance, seemed to grow larger by the second, its weapons at the ready. Bonner and the alien woman worked quickly, hacking into the flagship's systems and planting explosive charges near its main engines. The plan was simple: disable their power, take down their fleet's ability to respond, and then retreat. But the clock was ticking, and the risk was immeasurable. They planted the last charge just as alarms blared throughout the flagship. The ship's massive cannons turned in their direction. But it was too late. The charges detonated with a deafening explosion, sending a shockwave through the enemy fleet. The flagship's engines sputtered, and Bonner could see the chaos unfolding before him. Ships were spinning out of control, their systems failing as the command ship went dark. The enemy fleet, now in disarray, was left vulnerable. But there was no time to celebrate. The explosion had attracted the attention of every remaining ship in the fleet. Their weapons fired, and the small, cloaked human ship was caught in the crossfire. Bonner slammed his hand on the controls, trying desperately to steer the ship away from the incoming fire. The ship shook violently as blasts rocked them, but they kept moving, barely staying one step ahead of the enemy. "We've done it," Bonner shouted over the roar of the ship's failing engines. "We've taken them down." But even as he celebrated their success, a sudden jolt sent him flying across the room. The ship had been hit directly. The lights flickered, and everything seemed to slow down. The sound of the enemy weapons faded, replaced by the deafening silence of their own ship's imminent collapse. Bonner struggled to his feet, his vision blurred, but his first instinct was to check on her. She was there on the floor, but alive. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. "Bonner," she whispered, her voice breaking. We did it." He smiled, even as the ship groaned and the alarms blared once more. They had won. It didn't matter that they were about to crash. The impossible had happened. They had struck a blow against the enemy, against everything that had seemed insurmountable. And in that final moment, as the ship descended into darkness, Bonner realized that they had done more than just survive. They had proven that even the most broken bond could be repaired. Even in the face of certain death, they had found a way to fight together, to hope, and to win. The ship's descent was inevitable. The enemy's final strike had left them with no way to evade the relentless barrage of fire. Bonner's hands gripped the controls as the ship lurched violently once more, the once steady hum of the engines now replaced by the painful screech of metal under strain. He knew they were going down. There was no escaping it. The ship was too damaged, the systems too compromised. Beside him, the alien woman had fallen silent, her face a mask of determination, but her eyes reflected a deep weariness, the weight of everything they had gone through pressing down on her. She had fought beside him. She had trusted him. And now, they were both facing the end together. "We won," Bonner muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. "We actually won." The explosion had crippled the enemy fleet, but it hadn't been enough to ensure their own survival. The flagship, the heart of the enemy forces, had been disabled, but that victory came at a cost that neither of them had been prepared for. Bonner's mind raced as the ship plummeted toward the surface of an unknown world, the planet they had barely managed to identify in their final moments. It was a lifeless place, a cold, desolate landscape, and it was the only place they had left to go. He looked over at her once more. Her breathing was slow, steady, but she was visibly drained, every part of her worn thin by the chaos of the battle. Her hands rested at her sides, not in the fighting stance that Bonner had seen so many times before, but in a strange surrender, acceptance. She was done fighting, at least for now. The war had taken too much from both of them. The question now was whether they could make it to safety before the ship finally gave out. "I'm sorry," Bonner said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "I never thought we'd be in this position. I thought we'd make it." She didn't respond at first, her gaze fixed on the view ahead, the jagged landscape growing closer with every second. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can still make it," she said, her tone firm despite the fragility of their situation. "We've come this far. You and I. We made it out when no one thought we could." Bonner couldn't help but nod, his chest tight with emotion. It was a bittersweet realization. This strange alliance, born out of necessity, had grown into something more. It had become something neither of them could have predicted. Through the chaos, through the battle, they had found strength in one another. They were no longer enemies, but survivors. But as the ship hurtled closer to the ground, Bonner's heart sank. He knew this might be the end. The final crash was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "I'll take care of it," he said, looking over at her. "You need to get to the escape pod." The alien woman shook her head. "No, we stay together. We've always stayed together." Bonner didn't argue. There was no time left for that. The escape pods, though their only hope for survival, were too far. The only thing they had now was each other, and Bonner wouldn't leave her. Not now, not after everything they had been through. As the ship plunged toward the planet's surface, Bonner felt the weight of their impending fate settle over him. The ship's hull groaned as it began to break apart, the air inside growing thick with smoke and debris. He reached for the controls once more, trying desperately to level the descent, but it was hopeless. The ship's systems were failing faster than he could comprehend. There would be no miraculous escape. The ground below loomed ever closer. He had no idea if the surface would be hospitable or not. All he knew was that they had to try. He gritted his teeth and braced himself for the impact, hoping against hope that they might somehow survive. Then, with a violent jolt, the ship crashed to the planet's surface, the sound of metal tearing and the roar of fire drowning out everything else. Bonner's body was thrown forward, his face slamming into the console as the ship finally came to a halt. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. The pain was immediate, sharp, but it wasn't enough to overwhelm him. His mind was still clear, and when he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the alien woman, struggling to push herself up from the wreckage. "Are you?" Bonner began, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine," she interrupted, her voice strained, but resolute. She reached out for his hand, and despite the chaos around them, they pulled each other up, stumbling to their feet. The ship was wrecked, its hull torn open, the once advanced technology now a smoldering pile of debris. But they had survived. Against all odds, they had made it through. Together, they stumbled out of the wreckage, into the cold, barren world that now stretched out before them. The planet was unforgiving, a vast desert of jagged rocks and endless stretches of nothingness. But it was their world now. It was all they had. They could only rely on each other. No one was coming for them. No one was going to rescue them. As they looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the barren landscape, Bonner felt something deep inside, a flicker of hope, a sense of new beginnings. "We made it," he said quietly, his voice breaking through the silence. The alien woman glanced at him, her eyes softening. For the first time, there was something like peace in her gaze. "We did." In that moment, in the harshness of the alien desert, in the shadow of their shattered ship, they found something more powerful than any weapon: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from victory or conquest. It was a quiet, fragile hope born out of survival. A hope for a future where, perhaps, they could find redemption, not for the war, not for the destruction, but for the chance to rebuild something new, together. And so, in the dawning light of a new day, they walked into the unknown, side by side, the beginnings of a bond that had been forged in fire. Whatever came next, they would face it together.